Recalling an era when the color of your skin meant you paid to vote. By Smithsonian.com, adapted by News ELA staff on April 24th, 2017. Word count 884 words, level 1070 Lexile. Caption Image 1. President Lyndon Johnson left signs the 1965 Voting Rights Act that prohibited the use of literacy and poll tests used on black voters. Today, some states' voter ID laws have been ruled by courts to be discriminatory against minority voters. Photo Wikimedia Commons licensed under CC by SA BYSA 4.0. It was January 1955 when Leo Carter went to vote in Hardin County, Texas. It cost him $1.50 to cast his ballot. That would be about $13 today. The receipt for Carter's poll tax now has a place in the collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's a day's wages, William Pretzer, the museum's senior history curator, says. You're asking someone to pay a day's wages in order to be able to vote. Pretzer says the receipt, which was donated by Carr's family, is a significant example of the way that voting rights were denied to African Americans. Poll taxes, quite simply a tax to be able to vote, were enacted after the Civil War. They remained in effect until the 1960s. Both blacks and whites paid poll taxes. After the 1870s, particularly in the South, there was an effort to limit political power for African Americans, Pretzer says. In the immediate post-Civil War era, when voting rights were won by African Americans in the South, thousands registered, voted, and ran for office. Pretzer said white Southerners grew very concerned. One way to limit African American rights was to make it harder for them to vote. A series of state laws were passed in the South, ranging from literacy tests to poll taxes. The poll taxes were paid by white voters as well, but it affected black voters far more than whites. These laws were part of an effort to keep blacks as far out of politics as possible without violating the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That amendment prohibited governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. By 1902, 11 states had established a poll tax. Most of these states had other measures in place to intimidate voters. When people went to register to vote, their names would become known in the local community, Pretzer said. What you see is everything from simple harassment, people being insulted, pushed, shoved, or harassed on the streets, to being murdered. States owned voting rights. In 1937, the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in the country, ruled that poll taxes were legal because voting rights were granted by the states. Therefore, states may determine whether someone can vote as they see fit unless it conflicts with the 15th or 19th Amendments. The 15th Amendment gave people of color the right to vote. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. In 1962, the 24th Amendment was proposed, which would stop the use of poll taxes at the federal level. It became a law in 1964, but 5 states still use poll taxes for local elections. 2 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that poll taxes for any level of elections were unconstitutional. I feel like history repeats itself. Lena Carr says she donated the 1955 Texas poll tax receipt from her uncle partly because of her surprise that her family had been involved in the battle for voting rights in the civil rights era. The family found the receipt in a suitcase. My uncle never really talked a lot about voting, Carr says. It shocked me that he actually went out and participated and paid. Carr says she also hopes the donated receipt might be useful and inspiring. A lot of young people don't realize the things people had to go through to vote. Carr says that she is concerned about the voting restrictions that are being enacted in states ranging from Texas to Virginia to Wisconsin. I feel like history repeats itself, and if people don't start to become aware of what's happening in the world and take stock, we'll all be back at that point, Carr says. Troubling voter ID laws. During the 2016 presidential election, some voters, including former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, agreed with Carr's beliefs. The U.S. Attorney General is in charge of the Department of Justice. The department works with courts and police to enforce national laws. In 2012, Holder blasted Texas over its voter ID law, saying, "We call those poll taxes." He added that many people without IDs would have to travel great distances to get them. Smithsonian curator Bill Pretzer says it would be tough financially for an individual who doesn't have their own transportation to get a state or federal ID. The Department of Justice was involved in legal cases related to voter ID laws in Texas and North Carolina. On July 29, 2016, a federal appeals court struck down North Carolina's voter ID law. Texas was allowed to enforce its law during the 2014 elections and during its primaries in March 2016. In July of that year, a federal court ruled the law was discriminatory. Texas was ordered to soften the voter ID restrictions in time for the 2016 presidential election. It's still up to the Texas legislature to craft a new law that does not violate the federal voting rights law. Texas lawmakers are working on it.